Thank you for joining us today. Welcome. My name is Wolfgang Jamann. I'm joining you today from the Center's office in Berlin, Germany, and I'm the moderator for today's digital dialogue. For the benefit of participants who are blind or have visual impairment, I'll start with my short self-description. I'm a European male with white skin and ash blonde hair. I wear glasses and I wear a dark blue cardigan and a blue patterned shirt. I also have the beautiful Center's logo in the background of my video. The Digital Dialogue series is a regular kind of get-together of expert panels around cutting-edge digital developments that have an impact on civil society perspectives. Today, we'll focus on social media and content moderation, which from the many subscriptions seem to be a topic that many of us are deeply concerned about. We have not only heard the recent announcement by Mark Zuckerberg of the Meta concern on how they're changing content moderation and lifting some of the more strict policies around political and harmful content. We've seen this on other social platforms like X, former Twitter as well. And of course, all these developments have raised significant concerns at civil society and amongst those who are concerned about digital rights. We will bring you today together a panel of experts from the field of digital governance and human rights. And we have many civil society organizations working on these issues on the call. The main questions that we want to touch upon are, how is the content moderation policies of big tech, how are they evolving, including the move away from human moderation and the implications of AI-driven enforcement? What does it mean for civil society and marginalized communities, particularly around online harm? What about the broader consequences for the freedom of expression and democracy, which we all know are under attack? And then lastly, what can civil society do, or civil society organizations in particular, to navigate such changes? So to help us discuss these issues, we're very delighted to welcome the panel today, which consists of Robin Mansell, who is the scientific director at the International Observatory on Information and Democracy. We have Angela Minayu, Digital Rights and Policy Programs Officer at Article 19 in Eastern Africa. And we have Tandy Smith, Head of Programs at Media Monitoring Africa, based in South Africa. We'll have their bios dropped in the chat when each speaker provides their opening input. So, inviting Robin now to share, let's say, the key observations around, which is actually a rather big topic, and we're incredibly grateful that you and your institute have just recently published a report that helps us understand a bit better the relationship between information communication ecosystem and democracy. So please, over to you, Robin, and please begin with a self-description.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'm Robin Mansell. I'm a white woman, Canadian, who has lived in London for the last 35 years. I'm a retired academic. And as what was just said, I was privileged to become the scientific director for the Observatory on Information and Democracy about 15 months ago, because we aim to put together a world report on information ecosystems and troubled democracy. To give you an idea of the size of the scale of the effort, at one point we had 300 people involved in contributing from the Global South and the Global North. And it has 1,644 citations, which will either scare you or make you want to read it immediately. I know you're most interested in content moderation today, and so if you do take a look at the report, I direct you to chapters 3 and 7 particularly, because that's where content moderation is mostly discussed. I'm just going to make a few points because it's very difficult to summarize such a big effort briefly. I'll start with one big conclusion or observation from the report, and that is that mis or disinformation is only one factor that is troubling for democracy. It is a symptom of wider changes in society, and it amplifies some of those changes in society. And I think that is a very simple statement, but what it pushes against is the enormous focus on technology as being inevitably moving forward to bring about the changes that we're all experiencing. So we understand information ecosystems as being about people, about culture, about practices, and institutions or policy, not just all about technology. First main point about content moderation that I want to make is that we looked at many different types of content moderation, from flagging to filtering to promoting to demoting to deleting content. And what we found across the social sciences in the research literature is enormously inconsistent results in terms of what the impacts of that information is on trust, political polarization, etc. And this applied to all types of content moderation and the impact of information. And the reason for this is because of concepts that are defined differently, because of different kinds of designs and approaches to research in this area, very obviously about the scarcity of data, which all of you will be probably familiar with. But most importantly, I think, is that the greatest amount of research that we came across was very much about the effects or impact of information on individual attitudes and behaviors, and less about the power structures and asymmetries between the actors, especially the big tech firms, but also other actors who are motivated to generate mis and disinformation and hate speech in the first place. So that was my first point, enormous differences in terms of the outcomes of research. Another point specifically about the increasing role of AI, and particularly generative AI, that we found was that the rules for doing what is called risk assessment to see what the harms are associated with the use of these tools are vaguely defined across different pieces of legislation across countries, even though lots of rules are being put in place. And on content on platform moderation in particular, what we found is that despite the claims of some more technically oriented people that AI systems can be neutral, of course, they're not neutral. And what we uncovered over and over again was instances of the non-neutrality of the application of AI tools, especially when they are used for content moderation. A good example is their training on the English language, for example, which is not the language everywhere in the world. The report points out particularly that whenever content moderation is being used, choices must be made. They're made not only about the technology and the algorithms, but also the people controlling these systems are making choices. And the biggest issue, and what we know the least about, is who is empowered to make those choices. And the other lesson from the report is that AI tools by themselves, despite their popularity and the amount of research that is going into them, cannot alone counter mis and disinformation. Another point that I wanted to emphasize is that we looked at a lot of legislation to see how mis and disinformation is being defined across countries and regions. And the definitions of false information, if you like, are arbitrary in many cases. They are vague in many cases, and many cases in which legislation itself, which is designed ostensibly to protect us and people from harms from disinformation, was actually more designed to suppress speech, especially of those who are critical of authorities and elites. And we came across this many, many times, and it was very concerning. So finally, I don't want to take up too much time because I look forward to the dialogue. I think in considering what civil society's role can be in addressing so many of these questions that arise around content moderation is to evidence the injustices that are embedded in many of the practices, hold the actors and especially the big tech companies to account, and then emphasize that human rights protections are easy to say and very, very difficult to practice in this area. And the other thing that I should emphasize about our report is that although we reached out over 18 months to try to ensure that we had a good balance between evidence from the global north and the global majority world, we ended up with only 22% of our citations being to work in or on the global majority world. And that's concerning. And I think the major contribution that civil society organizations can make is to work towards decolonizing research and to press academics not to draw general conclusions from research which is really inspired by what goes on in the United States and or what goes on in Europe. And I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. That was a wonderful summary of a very, very rich report, and I can testify that some of the information that is in there is actually leading us into a more sophisticated analysis, particularly of the situation in the global north versus the majority world. I'm grateful for that. I'd have a couple of questions, but let's go through the protocol and continue with a perspective from maybe not just, but also from the global south. We have Angela Minayo. Please come on screen and please do begin with a self-description before you give us your perspective.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. Thank you. My name is Angela Minayo. I'm wearing a navy blue scarf, some white earpods. I am of African descent and I have braided hair and a yellow band. I hope that description is enough, and I have dark skin. Okay. So as I have been introduced, I work at Article 19 Eastern Africa. We are an international NGO that works to champion for freedom of expression and access to information. At Article 19 Eastern Africa, I lead the work on digital rights and policy for the region. And I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share on content moderation and what CSOs can do. First of all, I'd like to pick up from the previous speaker that a lot of global north policies, a lot of global north principles on content moderation are being applied to global south countries. And this means that a lot of principles, a lot of policies do not have global south values or principles. I'll give you an example of the Meta's adult nudity policy, which makes it illegal for such digital imagery to be on their platforms. Yet we have a substantial amount of indigenous communities that are based in the global south and whose freedom of expression is, curtailed because they cannot share this on this platform. So I wanted to just point out the disparity in applying or the unfairness in applying global north principles and values that are in these policies to the global south. Another thing I would like to just pick up from what Robin has talked on content moderation. Okay, yes, is the fact that content moderation is an arbitration of freedom of expression. There are companies, there are platforms making decisions on which content stays up, which content is being promoted, which content is being de-promoted, and these are freedom of expression decisions. Ideally, without before social media, this decision will have been made sometimes maybe in a court of law, and parties will be heard. But these decisions are being made to millions of posts every day. And so the challenge is, how do we make sure that these content moderation decisions are being done with human rights perspectives? How do we make sure that every post being moderated adheres to international human rights standards on freedom of expression or international human rights standards generally? So really the challenge is to make platforms aware of their global human rights responsibilities. Finally, and just to touch on the trends we are seeing towards a decentralized model of content moderation, is that while this might look like a very good idea that users are the ones who are moderating content, this has some negatives when it comes to freedom of expression. For instance, bias. Those of us who are on the X platform will tell you, for instance, that the community nodes sometimes has biased opinions, and because the people who are able to make the community nodes are able to make these nodes, then they have monopoly of what perspectives are being shared. Looking at the global South position, our digital literacy is a bit low compared to the global North. And therefore, we expect a lot of the community notes that will be put on the Meta's platforms will be from the global North. Again, when you talk about decolonizing the internet, when you talk about having a truly diverse internet, a truly diverse information ecosystem, we should be thinking through this lens and not making decisions that might give a stronger position to global North perspectives that might reinforce and entrench already existing global North narratives. So my challenge to everyone on this call is to start thinking about who is making these content moderation decisions. Are they doing it from a position of human rights? Or is it based on a policy at this platform level that might actually be clashing or even contradicting freedom of expression standard? Unless you have any other additional question, I'll end it at that. And of course, this is a very complex topic. I might not be able to distill all the principles of freedom of expression and content moderation, but I hope that I have shared more of a global South, a more holistic approach to content moderation that looks at human rights as well.
Thank you, Angela, and indeed you did. And thanks for that. Thanks for also showing us how the perspective from the global South can look like concretely. Robin already mentioned the question of who, so who is moderating the content, but who also has the possibility to make decisions. So this is an open question that we may want to dive into. But for now, let's leave it at that. And let's also have in mind that your key concern, the freedom of expression, is something that is not accidentally under attack, but possibly deliberately under attack. And this is something that civil society needs to be concerned about. I would like to invite Andy Smith now, and you're also based in the Global South, but of course you work for a different organization, Media Monitoring Africa, and you are trying to deal with the issues in a very kind of innovative way. So Andy, why don't you start with the self-description and then go into your perspective.
Right, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you all discussing this really topical issue at the moment. A self-description: I am a white female, like I said, based in South Africa, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm wearing glasses. I have dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a light green top. To give a bit of background about Media Monitoring Africa, we were established in 1993 to monitor and analyze the coverage of South Africa's first democratic elections. Since then, we've grown into an organization that advocates for a responsible quality media sector or information ecosystem that works in defense of human rights and contributes to a strengthened democracy and a just and fair society. Through our various program areas, we also focus on strengthening information integrity through a human rights-based approach to accountability, online safety, and open information. We know that online mis- and disinformation campaigns are eroding the integrity of our information ecosystems, and platforms are profiting from harmful content. When we talk about disinformation, we rely on the definition of disinformation encompasses false, inaccurate or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted online to intentionally cause public harm to generate profits. I think it's so important that we all are on the same page or understand what we actually mean by online harms and disinformation when we refer to the terms. So Media Monitoring Africa has been doing a lot of work around media credibility and combating disinformation over the last few years. One of our key initiatives around combating disinformation has been the development of a platform called Real 411. We built Real 411 in the lead up to our national government elections in 2019 as a platform to report election-related disinformation, not only to report the disinformation content, but a platform that takes action against disinformation. Since then, the platform has grown to look at 4 different categories of online harms, being disinformation, hate speech, harassment, and incitement to violence. Content or complaints get submitted, they get assessed by 3 individual experts, and an outcome is then published. Where further action is needed, further action is taken under our existing legislation and through existing entities, bodies. One such entity be the South African Human Rights Commission. So this brings me to one of the key points or the discussions that I wanted to raise today, and that is around a new initiative that we have been working on, because we know that even with the civic tech platforms, with these tools, and with all the incredible work that is being done around combating online harms and disinformation, something more is needed. So MMA has proposed a rights-based approach to safeguarding information ecosystems and promoting accountable platform governance. And this is through the concept of an online integrity ombud. Online integrity ombud would focus on platform accountability and disinformation for now, while this concept and initiative is being developed. We are focusing on disinformation, not necessarily other online harms. It is not intended to be a super regulator or an all-encompassing body that addresses digital harms, rather a body that is responsible for ensuring that platforms adopt responsible content moderation and curation practices. While existing complaint mechanisms do exist in South Africa, they are either too broad or too narrow to address specific focus areas that we envision the online integrity ombud could address. One really important area that we are including in this initiative is that the online integrity ombud would or could also support digital literacy initiatives that empower users and request transparency reports from platforms. The concept is that the ombud, the online integrity ombud, would be funded by the platforms with additional funds for user support and digital literacy initiatives. This concept is really still in very early stages. We're engaging with various stakeholders and partners to explore effective processes and mechanisms to take this further. However, the goal is to help people become more critically engaged, expose online harms like mis and disinformation, and holding platforms accountable. And I think I will stop there. I'm really looking forward to engagement and questions, and maybe some of the audience may have some answers for me as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks for sharing the very practical examples, both of Real 411 and the Ombud project, which I understand is in the making and is yet to stand, of course, the test of time, but very encouraging to see such initiatives coming from a place in the global majority world. I would like us now to come back on the screen, all 3 of you, and we'll have a little round of, let's say, mutual discussion. What have we heard from the colleagues that we want to know more on, that has surprised us, maybe that we have a challenge about. I would like to start in a slightly different order. So Angela, I would love to start with you. If you could come back on the screen again, I think you are. What have you heard? What do you have? What comments and challenges and maybe questions to have to your fellow panelists?
I was really taken by Robin's presentation. I really liked the fact that she pointed out that the idea that it is technologies that are bringing their harms, and not thinking that it's society changing. And this is reflective in the online harms we're seeing. I think that's a very important note to take, because a lot of the challenge I've had is policymakers making this distinction between this is just a technology issue and then this is a society issue. So Robin, I really like the fact that you pointed that out, that the threats to democracy, the threats to civic engagement, the threat to freedom of expression has existed even before the advent of the technological emerging technologies we see now. I just want to add on that. For instance, with AI, you'd think that the challenges that AI will pose on freedom of expression are new, but they're not. They have existed before. Copyright has been used to challenge access to information and freedom of expression. Artificial intelligence, especially generative AI, is going to struggle with copyright. Misinformation and disinformation is now easily produced using emerging technologies like AI. Again, same challenge to information ecosystem, same challenges that we as digital rights activists have been trying to sort. So I just like that these problems are not new, they're existing and just amplified on social media and on these platforms, and they should not be seen as isolated in that context alone. It exists in a wider crisis in terms of freedom of expression and democracy. So thank you, Robin.
Thanks, Angela, and we'll have Robin respond to that. I have to say I similarly was inspired by that observation, but whether it's the chicken or the egg that is first, I haven't really figured out, and I think there is a bit of mutual kind of reinforcement of what is happening in society and the political sphere, and what technological development is either amplifying or bringing about. So I think it's a serious discussion that we'll have to have. And also this might answer, to a certain extent, the question of where is intervention needed most, and where can we have maybe most likely chances for success. I want to continue with Tandy. What have you heard from Angela and Robin, and what would you like to either highlight or challenge or have comments or questions about?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's interesting because the contributions and input have been, fascinating, and I think that the panelists, all three of us, have very similar sort of approaches to these issues where we're looking at balancing freedom of expression with moderating harmful content. And I think that is where the biggest challenge lies, is where do you draw the line? And I think it's a question that no one has necessarily been able to answer, because I think if it was easy, we wouldn't be dealing with these challenges. But it really is that about balancing the freedom of expression. And Angela, I agree. I think it's spot on as well. And what we've heard from Robin, these the culmination of information and where we are in society, and the technology or the platforms are simply the tools that has created this environment where this information and where these online harms can go viral. But I think that's where the point is that yes, we're not dealing with new phenomenon of disinformation or hate speech or incitement to violence, but we are dealing with new platforms and new technologies of disseminating that information. And so you almost have to work in parallel. Yes, you have to manage what's creating the environment to where people are able to or want to spread online harms and disinformation, but you also need to intervene at the point of the technology that's creating this enabling environment. So yeah, I support and agree with much of what my fellow panelists have said, but I think it is also important to make that distinction.
Thank you, Tandy. And now over to Robin. I mean, Robin, I'm sure you've had many conversations with colleagues like we have on the panel from the majority world, and the perspectives, I'm sure, have informed your observations. But still, what have you heard? What would you be more interested, or how do you want to address some of the questions that have been put also in your directions?
Thank you. It's really nice when we all agree. But as Sandy said, what happens in practice is that we run into these really, really difficult struggles over whose voices are going to take precedence when decisions are made. And I think that is just really the heart of the issue, is where does the power rest in order to make changes? On the point about not putting technology first, I would fully agree that there are reciprocal relationships between what goes on amongst people, communities, society, and technology. What the report does is it pushes back against those who always seem to start with the technology. And so many people start with it as if it was value-free, even though we have 50 years of people saying that technology is embedded with values. So I think that's the reason for the report, starting from that perspective. One thing I wanted to highlight, I think that is particularly problematic when we talk about the human rights aspect of dealing with misinformation, is there's so much reference which is made, for example, to Article 19 of freedom of expression, rightfully so, and protecting it as a fundamental human right. But especially in the United States, for example, there is complete neglect of Article 29, which does open up possibilities for putting in place some restraints, which is exactly where the problem lies, on that freedom of expression in order to protect all people and all of their rights. And it seems to me that the discourse that we have today around coping with mis and disinformation or hate speech and the actions that go on digital platforms really consistently neglects the fact that that tension has always been there. And whether we're talking about propaganda or we're talking about taking steps like an ombud organization or a set of people would probably have to grapple with, that tension, I think, always needs to be brought back in the frame, that it is a very real one, it is a fundamental one, and it is the sort of the linchpin around which decisions about what content should be allowed to flow and what should not, because it is harmful to various rights. I think the other thing I didn't emphasize when I spoke earlier was that a lot of attention is focused on information, and rightly so. I would say that there is a crisis of information and it is harmful for democracy. But the reasons for that do really have to do with the actors themselves, people who are motivated. And a set of people who are motivated is the owners and controllers of the big tech platforms. So unless initiatives work in parallel, not only to deal with the real day-to-day, month-to-month problems of destabilizing democracies because information is going viral and is harmful, we also need to tackle the fundamental business models of these big tech companies. And that raises a whole additional set of issues. Where do you start? Countries are trying to push back through putting legislation in place. But what we saw in the report over and over again is that the implementation is difficult. A, because the political will is not always there. B, because the people and resources to actually implement legislation are not necessarily there. Just to give you a case in point, the UK Online Safety Act, which will go into operation shortly, has Ofcom, the regulator, has had to hire 300 more staff just to begin to implement that legislation. And it would double its staff. UK is a relatively rich country, and it can probably do that. What happens in countries where resources are already thinly spread when you try to implement legislation? So my question to my fellow panelists is, do you see the work on content moderation working in parallel with other strategies which are designed to push back on the big tech company business models? Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, and thanks for posing a question for follow-up. First of all, I want to express gratitude for all the comments that we're getting in the chat. I'm trying to monitor some of them with the colleagues that are helping me here at the center. We also had a few comments that came in early during the registrations. And I would like to bring to the panel, let's say, 2 or 3 main comments or let's say clusters of comments that we have seen. I mean, first of all, it's clear that we are not just here to talk about content moderation, although that is a key kind of game changer at the moment, but it is an indication for some of the bigger maybe tectonic shifts happening both in technology and society. So let's just acknowledge that. There are a couple of comments that are simply pointing in the direction of what should we as civil society do, and where can we be most effective in either collective advocacy initiatives. One colleague, Jess, was proposing that we all move collectively, to more ethical platforms rather than focusing on advocating or platform accountability. Are there initiatives that are maybe, well, quick wins is maybe the wrong word, but somehow more within reach than changing a system that is characterized by big business models? So that's one question. Where should civil society focus on, and where do we have the biggest chances to succeed? Secondly, there is a slightly less pessimistic kind of stream of comments that is basically saying, well, how can big tech help us to deal with mobbing, intimidation, online harm? We know that there is at least a potential kind of for support to our concerns out there, and how do we mobilize that rather than having to accept that everything that is coming out of big tech is harmful to us, although it's difficult, I admit, to maintain that kind of perspective right now, in particular, from what we see in the US. And then lastly, there is I think a wonderful question from a colleague who's wondering, can digital cohesion kind of help us to overcome polarization? And of course, polarization in society that we're all dealing with. Can what we were expecting from the internet and from social media platform in the beginning, as unlimited access to information and communication, can that not help us to overcome some of the polarized tendencies in our societies? So with these 3 kind of clusters, could I come back to the panel and this time maybe start with Tandy? Any reflections on what we've heard from the audience?
Thank you very much. And yeah, some really great thoughtful input as well. So thank you for those. I think that my first response would be that I think we need to work and tackle these issues in parallel. I think that, often when we have these conversations, and sorry, I'm going off on a little bit of a diverged point, but I think it is important to remember that often when we have these conversations and we focus on platforms and technology and content, we forget that there are many countries in the world that still don't enjoy full access to the platforms that we do. And I understand that the focus of this is about content moderation, but we can't only focus on the big platforms. We can't only focus on big tech. In South Africa, for example, we still struggle massively with the concept of a digital divide. Those who are online and those who are still have limited access, both to data, to infrastructure, to devices. But what we do see is that the information channels and the platforms that they do have access to, you still see issues of disinformation, misinformation, online harms in other areas. And so it's a multi-pronged approach dealing with these issues of big tech accountability and changing business models, of content moderation, where you're balancing freedom of expression with the limitations. And, in South Africa, we have the limitations to freedom of expression in our constitution, as well as then digital literacy and literacy around engaging online, around disinformation, misinformation, and other online harms. I think we have seen how disinformation and incitement to violence in the online space quite easily and quickly translates into a offline physical eruption of violence. And I think not only in South Africa, but in many places around the world, we've seen examples. And so my initial reaction is, there isn't one answer. And that's why, civil society is I think such a strong advocate for this, because there are so many different organizations targeting different elements and targeting different channels. And if we can somehow sort of bring that together, where we are challenging big tech business models and holding platforms accountable, I don't think it's going to be the answer of just moving away from the existing big tech platforms, because yes, there are other platforms and other models that are gaining popularity, but it's not taking away the problem. And I think that the same tools and the same platforms that are environments for online harms can be the same tech and the same platforms that can provide tools and literacy and connection into finding ways to combat these challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Tanya. And you've given us some examples from your own background on that encouraging note. Let me continue with Robin. How do you see any of the three kind of dimensions that I've mentioned? The where are we most effective? What's the potential getting big tech working on our sides, and what's the potential for social media and the platforms generally for overcoming polarization in society?
I wish I could be optimistic about getting the biggest tech companies to really take seriously some of the harms that they are responsible for. But on the more positive side, at least at the moment, they are all wholly dependent on advertising revenues, at least for the time being. So there are ways in which there can be pushback on them, and they are all concerned about their profitability and the bottom line. And so in some senses, taking actions which will cause them to be a little bit worried may be and can be helpful. I wanted to point out, though, that we came across a wide variety of resistance strategies, mostly coming from civil society organizations who are developing quite remarkable alternatives. I understand that they don't necessarily grow as much, but alternative frameworks for controlling data, for example, alternative decentralized frameworks for ownership and control of both technology, hardware, but also software and decision-making about how the sites work, are sprouting all over the place. And we don't have systematic accounts of who is doing that, and we really need that. And another aspect which I think is quite important is we came across a number of instances in which various coalitions and groups, feminists, people who are activists on particular issues, actually see polarization as a plus in a sense, in the sense that if people are engaging within relatively polarized and segmented bubbles, if you like, online, they can often seek protections that would not otherwise be available to them and protect themselves. So there are some ways in which the existing platforms can work to the advantage of those who are disempowered. And I guess the last thing I should say is I fully take on board that connectivity does not exist anywhere, everywhere, and that this is a problem. And I think the opportunity is that for places where there is not as much inclusion and what is there is not necessarily affordable, this is an opportunity for places not to just copy what has gone on in the global north. I mean, we have made a mess in many ways, and the opportunity is there potentially to do differently. And I think that is what the ambition has to be, and civil society organizations are helping with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. And that leads straight into your initial argument, Angela. Is there a decolonized way of dealing with social media?
Thank you. I really liked listening to the panelists. It was interesting to find people who have very interesting perspectives on this. What will the decolonial approach to social media content moderation or tech regulation look like? I have bad news and then I have good news. So I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is that from this part of the world where I come from, we have been copying and pasting a lot of laws and regulations regarding platform regulation, data protection. Now we have the UN Cybercrime Convention that will most probably find its way into our legislation. So there's almost, you can almost see what people are calling the Brussels effect, where the EU regulations and guidelines are replicated in other countries. And that means that countries in the global majority, not all, but some, are not reimagining what platform regulation can look like, what tech regulation can look like, what the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which only came in 2015. Still new regulation, businesses are still struggling to even understand how to make sure that they do human rights impact assessments in their supply chains and all this. So Africa, where I come from, needs to start also reviewing tech from its own perspective, from its own values. We have digital rights campaigns around a digital Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the African principle that I exist because you exist. And this would mean, for instance, that our approach to certain values or certain digital rights issues will be different. It's a more communal approach as opposed to the Eurocentric approach, which is what we see in the EU regulation. Africa is more of a community-centered approach. We want to look at rights maybe from a community point of view, from our local context, from our own nuances, and not necessarily just because I have to click yes to use the terms, to use this platform, and therefore I have no say in their content moderation policies and all that. So it's really a challenge to reimagine Africa or the global majority in these conversations because, as I said earlier, most Eurocentric values and principles are reinforced in the terms of use. Again, remember that these platforms are in Silicon Valley, they're not in Africa, and they feel like they don't really have to consult or engage stakeholders from this part of the world. And in doing so, they miss out on context, like the Ubuntu context, like our community-centered approach to things, and we end up with platforms that don't speak to us at all. Can we leave the platforms? No. I think there's a lot of room to meaningfully engage platforms. And where can CSOs effectively engage? I believe it is when CSOs start to think about the policies that bring out the negative impacts or the negative harm or the harms that you're seeing. So for instance, if your problem is on misinformation and disinformation and how it is being moderated, look at the moderation policies that are being implemented or being enforced in this content moderation, and then find ways to challenge them. For Meta, for instance, there's the oversight board, which calls for submission from stakeholders to tell them how to decide these cases. I think that is an avenue to truly change policy, because and this is what I've had for a long time, that content moderation policies are biased. Content moderation is biased against global majority content because they lack nuance with all these things. But really, it's because the policies themselves lack this nuance, and therefore, even if the moderator was based in Africa, they will come to the same conclusion sometimes because they're just implementing the policy as it is. So we can effectively engage by trying to change the policies that bring about the harms. Thank you.
No, thanks, Angela, so much, and for both the challenge and, of course, also for leading a little bit into a slightly more, I would say, optimistic picture, because what you're describing is not theory. I mean, there's a lot of capacity and political activism that is coming, particularly from areas where you are based. You know, the competency that we find in East Africa is just incredible, and I have no doubt that this will play a bigger political role as we go. And I can't help mentioning that you've mentioned the oversight board of Meta. They've just changed the executive director. So the new director is the former executive director of Transparency International, a very, very passionate human rights activist. So that's an interesting kind of position fulfillment that we are seeing there. And I would say there's some rays of hope. We are coming to the end of a very rich, but of course not a complete conversation. There's an abundance of comments and resources that are being mentioned in the chat. Thanks for everyone who put in links to resource bases, to events that are happening, the Pre-RightsCon meeting very soon, and some Substack resources. So thanks for all of that. We do have a minute, and I want to mention one final comment that we got from Gracie Tumbiri. I'm not sure whether we have a good answer to that, but she's asking, she's from the University of Cape Town, what happens when the era of these populist leaders and owners like Zuckerberg ends? Will we ever go back to sanity, especially on social media? Will we? We would hope so. Any final word from any of you? Maybe Robin, what would you say? Is that a too optimistic statement?
I would have to say that we have to live in hope. There's no point in despairing. I think the current period is one of multiple crises compounded upon the other, only one of which is information. And the populist move is well underway, and we can only hope that it is pushed back by the actions, particularly of civil society organizations, but not only. I mean, there are lots of politicians who are not necessarily oriented in that direction. So,
thank you very much. Yes, we can't give up hope, and we have reached the top of the hour. I want to thank particularly the sign language interpreters. Thanks for being with us for this hour and helping us to provide accessibility. Thanks for the wonderful panel, and also thanks for the work that you're doing both in the scientific and the political activist kind of sphere. Stay tuned. We'll send out the recording within a week's time, and there will be room for further engagement over those critical topics. Thank you very much, everyone who attended, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the day.